Your Extraordinary Life Chatham Ken. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards. I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Steve Barati. Steve, welcome back.
Hey, great to be back.
Yeah, nice to be in the groove in this podcast, vlog cast, wherever you're finding this. If you are finding this on YouTube, then go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the bell, as they say.
The bell. Ring the bell, please.
Ring the bell, please. If you're seeing it on Instagram or even TikTok now, Facebook, you're getting this via our emails or inside the Facebook group, and that's all great. Any questions, you can post them below in the comments. We'll tackle them on future podcasts. If you do want to reach out to us and need help solving a spine-related health problem or working with our fitness team, then again, you can look for the links here that I'll provide below and you can follow through and you'll get access to us and we'll be able to have a consultation to find out more about your case and then decide if that's something we can help you with. Today's episode is salt. The salt myth, if you will. Is that the book you had read, The Salt Myth? Is that what it's called?
Salt Fix.
The Salt Fix.
Salt Fix by Dr. James DiNicolantonio.
Okay,
yeah.
That's a mouthful.
It's a mouthful, but yeah, The Salt Fix. And so one of the big themes in this book is that he's talking about the role of salt and how it's really an essential mineral. And in terms of how we've always thought about salt, or at least thought about salt in the last 50 to 60 years, it's become demonized. But really, as he puts it, it's the wrong white crystal that we've really been pointing
right,
the finger
it's
at.
true. Well, it reminds me actually of cholesterol and how cholesterol has been demonized over the last 30, 40 years. And the same thing, cholesterol is a nutrient in the body. Cholesterol is part of our cell membranes, part of our brain. Really, all the components of the body require a certain level of cholesterol for optimization, and the same is true with salt. So, as you said, it's become demonized. People are on low salt diets, low sodium diets. They're afraid to salt their food. They're looking at labels to see if there's salt. And I think, and I believe you're the same here, but I think people are missing the point.
Absolutely. And, when we look back in time, people used to consume a lot more salt than we do today. Think back prior to refrigeration. We would have to use salt to preserve our foods. Even if you think about, what people would have to eat, a lot of the conversation now is about, consuming nose to tail.
Right.
Right. And a lot of people don't know this, but, the blood is very salty. There's about a teaspoon and a half of salt in the blood. And, think about a lion, right? A lion makes a kill and, he's covered in this blood. You got to get to the blood before we get to the meat tissue.
Yep.
Right. And that's primarily what we're eating now is we're eating the meat tissue, but we're not getting all that other stuff. And again,
sodium, collagen, there's all these different components. In fact, when you're eating mostly muscle meat, there is actually a risk. We're talking about eating healthy animal products, but we are reminding you that tip to tail is the ideal. There's so many other components to that beyond just the bone and the connective tissues. But when you are eating mostly muscle meats, there's actually a risk there. I believe it's called rabid starvation, where I think it was hunters, in the wintertime, and they were getting access just to, say, rabbits, and they were only eating lean muscle meat, high in, I believe it's methionine. And because you're not getting the proper mix of amino acids and other collagen and all the other pieces, this imbalance can actually create, I believe, I'd have to go back and look, but almost maybe an ammonia toxification.
No, I haven't heard of this, but
the same idea, right? Is that there's just pieces to the puzzle here. And, yes, I think there's an innate drive. You get that, as you mentioned in our pre-show, thirst. When you're thirsty, you have this innate drive towards thirst. And the same thing when you're craving salty foods. Now, that doesn't give people the freedom to just go, bang down a bag of salt and vinegar chips and assume they've met their body's need.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's a big part of the conversation is because we're talking about salt, right? We're not just talking about, giving you the freedom to, knock down all these heavily processed foods,
right.
But it's more, using salt to elevate your diet, right? Using salt to elevate, the taste of, these whole foods that we like to talk about that, you need to be eating. And so by using salt, right, liberally, as I've been doing, there are very few negative consequences. And
right. Well, let's talk about some of the research then. I think we recognize that sodium, or most people recognize that sodium as a part of, nature. Salt is something that, again, for centuries, people have sought out salt.
Yes.
That's become a major resource. And only over the last 50 years, as research was originally done, and we'll talk today about how some of that was, heavily flawed. No different again than cholesterol and saturated fats that were vilified now have been unvilified in terms of things that are, I guess, not bad for you now, even though they were the reality is they never were. And the same is true with salt. So talk about some of the research of how this originated and how people's idea around salt got skewed right from the start.
Yeah, I think a big one here that people link salt to is things like hypertension, right? Increased blood pressure. When you go back, I think it was 1950s, 1960s, there was a researcher, his name was Louis Dahl, and what he was trying to do was link, salt intake to blood pressure.
Okay.
And so he was, studying rats, looking at salt intake in the rats, and was trying to increase that salt intake. Wasn't seeing a huge effect, but then started to breed more salt-sensitive rats in his research. And then from there, they were able to see, okay, well, now there's this link and this connection.
Right, but only after the rats had been bred for salt sensitivity.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, they're right from the get-go, there's a flaw that was there. And when we look at things such as the prevalence of certain disease processes like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, a lot of these have been on the rise, and salt has been a big part of that conversation. But we were consuming, as we talked about, a lot more salt, in years past compared to what we are now, and yet we can still see that.
Right. If you look at the incidence data, you're seeing and it's the same thing. We'll come back to cholesterol, but as cholesterol intake has dropped, we're not seeing a drop in heart disease.
No, absolutely.
As fat intake has dropped drastically over the last 40, 50 years, we're not seeing a decrease in cardiovascular dysfunction. And the same is true with salt. We're seeing this big decrease in salt, and yet we're not seeing this drop. At what point do people start to realize that taking out real food from your diet is not going to lead to positive outcomes? Steve, you were talking about some research that I thought was interesting that I'll mention, that 50% of people with hypertension are actually not affected by salt intake up or down. And then of the other 50%, lowering their salt intake only has a 2% change in their systolic blood pressure. So if you're looking at reducing hypertension by salt reduction, it's only a small group of people that are affected by it. And then I'll let you comment here is, and does that actually decrease their chance of dying? Because that's like people taking statins. Yes, it lowers your cholesterol, but does it decrease your chance of dying?
No, and there's even been, clinical trials looking at, increased salt intake versus less salt intake. And those who are, having increased salt intake actually have less chance of mortality and heart disease and chances of stroke. And, on the contrary, lowering your salt intake has quite a few negative consequences as well. It's going to increase things like your heart rate. It's going to decrease things like blood volume. There's going to be stress hormones that are released that can start to, stiffen the arterial walls, which is also going to
increase cardiovascular dysfunction
and increase blood pressure, right? And so, are we looking at just myopically, just that 2% decrease in that systolic blood pressure and saying, yeah, there is a decrease in blood pressure, but we're ignoring all the other effects.
It reminds me a lot of rocks and sand and that, comparison concept that we talk about a lot. You have this jar that is your life, and I'm using my coffee cup here, but the jar is your life, and you want to get all the important things in it. What makes more sense? Do you put all the sand in, then the rocks, the pebbles, and then try and jam all the rocks in? Or does it make more sense that you put the rocks being the most important things in your life at first, and then the pebbles and the sand? And the same is true here. Is we just see so many people who are so lost in terms of their health. And it's to the point where I think I probably sugar-coated it, which is the other white crystal, if you're wondering what that is.
Yeah.
I've sugar-coated it probably far too long in my career because, I didn't want to have people upset or think, oh my God, he's talking about me. But at this point, I've reached the stage where I guess I don't care as much. And I'm more concerned about people getting results and people not doing things that are taking them away from an amazing life that they could be having. And so you have to think about rocks, and that's the blueprint that we created. Are you training and exercising? Regardless if you're a beginner, if you're a newbie, or if you've been doing it a long time, it's something you need to do. How's your sleep? Is that a routine that can be improved upon? How does your spine and nervous system function? Is it allowing your brain to regulate the body? Is it creating interference in the normal processes? What is your diet like? And the same is true here. Our recommendations around salt, which we'll talk about next. The preface here, and you already mentioned it, is we're not saying go out and eat a bunch of processed food in order to get salt. We're saying liberally salt your food to taste and take advantage of the taste that comes along with salt.
Yes.
For me, I know the majority, last night, for example, we had ground beef. And I know it sounds crazy to people, like, what'd you have for dinner? Well, we had ground beef. No, we had pasta, we had some, dish by name. We had ground beef.
Yeah.
Now I salted it. I added a little bit of taco seasoning on it.
Mhm.
and I had some. I actually used cottage cheese, and I believe we had some cucumbers. That was my dinner last night.
It's simple.
It's simple. And so, Steve, talk about our recommendations, and then we'll leave people with that so they can practice this on their own. What are our simple recommendations for the majority of people to make sure they're getting adequate sodium in their diet?
Oh, well, I think a big one is also, before I get into that, talking about, the best types of salt.
Okay, great. Do that.
Because, table salt is often, the one thing that comes to mind.
Right.
And table salt is void of a lot of essential
Basically
nutrients.
stripped of all the essential
Exactly.
nutrients.
Think about it almost like being bleached, right?
Right.
It's bleached white. And so it's not the salt we're primarily talking
Right.
about, right? Although, again, don't be scared of this white crystal as we
Sure,
talk
sure.
about. But there's things like, Himalayan salt.
Yeah.
A lot of people talk about that, but then there's a company and a brand, Redmond Sea Salt.
Yes, that's a great brand.
Yeah, that's a great brand, and it comes from an ancient lake.
Yeah.
And so there's
Basically, we're looking at mineralized salt. So it's not just sodium, but it's a mix of other minerals that are in there as well. So I think people
Exactly.
think of sodium and salt as the same, and they're not necessarily the same. Salt is composed of different minerals.
magnesium, potassium.
Exactly, with sodium being the primary one,
Exactly.
but not solely in and of itself. And so finding a good source of salt, I use the pink Himalayan sea salt. I've used the Redmond Real
Mhm.
Salt, I believe it's called.
Mhm.
There's probably some other brands as well.
Yeah, not that we're familiar with, but
Yeah, you get the idea, which is
Yeah.
the point and the principle. And then in terms of what to do, salting your food to taste,
yes.
and then adding in some salt. I
And-
think morning and night is what I do, but
Yeah, especially if I'm going to be exercising and we're heading into warmer summer months.
right.
And so
Sweating,
one of the
exercising.
primary losses of salt in our bodies is
Right.
through sweat.
Right.
Right. And so making sure you're going to be replenishing that. So
Yeah.
if I'm going to be outside on a hot day for
Yeah.
more than an hour exercising, I want to make sure that I'm putting in around a teaspoon of salt
Okay.
in my water. A lot of people don't like that as much
Yeah.
because they almost think about it as tasting like that sweat.
Yes. Yeah.
So one method that I've been testing out is actually putting that half teaspoon to a teaspoon
Mhm.
of salt into like a little cup, right? Adding a little bit of either lime juice, lemon juice, grapefruit juice on top just
Yep.
to get it wet. And then adding it about an ounce of water, take it like a shot, and then increase my fluid intake for the next 20, 30 minutes before I go outside
Right.
to do that exercise.
There's another, for me, what I do is same thing, flavor. Here's how I do it. Morning, I'll have a huge glass of water, and I'll put a half a teaspoon of salt, and I just drink it. I want to get super hydrated. First thing that I do when I wake up is part of my morning routine.
Mhm.
And then at night, I do the same thing. But in both of those cases, I add a small amount of magnesium.
Mm.
So instead of just taking magnesium at night now, I've been adding it a little bit in the morning, a little bit at night. I chug both of those, and then throughout the day, if I have a water bottle, I'll add my salt and I'll add a little magnesium in there because the magnesium is flavored.
Mm.
And so I just shake that up, mix it, and it's essentially like drinking whatever the flavor of the magnesium is. It's an orange or a raspberry or some kind of berry flavored drink. And that's a way you can do it too. It's just that's my drink, is carry that around, drink that all day.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I think the take home here is that we shouldn't be afraid of using salt
Right.
in our foods, having it in our diets. And I think a big part of that is, no, we're not talking about, that bag of chips that, is sitting in your cupboard or, having you.
Right. Adding in processed foods that don't fall within, the Eat by Design model. It's
Mhm.
eating real foods and then salting them to taste and adding a little bit more in terms of your hydration throughout the day.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Guys, if you have any questions for the show you want us to tackle, put them on here. If you need to reach out to us and contact us, then again, I'll put the links in here somewhere. Follow us on social media. If it's on YouTube, hit the bell, subscribe, and Instagram, TikTok, pretty much everywhere now at this point. And
Yeah.
check your email because we're probably in there too. Okay, guys,
Probably.
thank you for joining the drive to make Chatham Kent the healthiest community in Canada.
See you guys.